So, we got some news out of the way, so let's move on to some propaganda. Where I talk about
State of the state.
the state of the state.
State of the state.
Now, any failure of communism reaffirms the promise of Marxist historiography, and the specter continues to grow. That's right, communism failing actually makes the specter grow. The capitalist state apparatuses first told us that communism was over. History had reached its conclusion, and we were going to ride the wave of neoliberalism to utopia. Now they're realizing that the specter of communism is still haunting, and it never stopped haunting. In fact, the more communism became relegated to the margins, the more it continues to haunt. The less capitalism has to worry about communism, the more capitalism is able to accelerate the tensions within itself. And when the tensions within capitalism grow, the specter of communism grows. In Althusser's book On the Reproduction of Capitalism, also known as Ideology and Ideological State Apparatuses, he begins with a fairly simple explanation of what philosophy is. Bear with me here, because I'll loop back around to my original idea about the specter of communism growing. In the book, he argues that Gramsci is right when he claims, quote, everyone is a philosopher. But Althusser correctly adds that there's a difference between everyday philosophy and capital P philosophy. There's also a difference between traditional, quote, philosophies, as in folk understandings of the world, and philosophy with a capital P. Althusser writes, quote, while common sense philosophy has, it seems, always existed, capital P philosophy has not. Everyone knows how Lenin begins his famous book, State and Revolution. He points out that the state has not always existed. He adds that the state is observed to exist only in societies.
You know, we're living in a society
in which social classes exist. We shall make a remark of the same sort, but it will be a little more complicated. We shall say that philosophy has not always existed. Philosophy is observed to exist in societies in which 1. Social classes and therefore the state exists, and 2. Science or one science exists.
My answer is something called science.
End quote. Althusser then goes on to define science, and he means it much more broadly than we typically understand science. Basically, by science, he means, quote, an abstract ideal, or rather idea-dependent discipline that proceeds by way of abstractions and demonstrations, end quote. Then, Althusser gives some historical examples. For example, he says the creation of the Macedonian Empire and the end of the city-state, combined with the idea of a biological science, created Aristotle and Aristotelianism. I'll give more examples. Another example Althusser gives is the development of legal mercantile relations under the absolute monarchy, combined with the foundation of mathematical physics by Galileo, created Descartes and Cartesianism. Another example Althusser gives is Hegel wrote in a time after the French Revolution, after the Thermidorian reaction, and after the Napoleonic suppression of the Fourth Estate and Civil Law Code. This was all taking place in the context of the first approaches to a theory of history, and then that yields Hegel and Hegelianism. And then finally, Althusser also gives Marx as an example. He says Marx and Marxism-Leninism develop out of a combination of the emergence, growth, and first struggles, failures, and victory of the workers' movement. In the science of history founded by Marx called dialectical materialism. So what's the impact of this? The impact is that a philosophical system remains relevant as long as the conditions that created that philosophical system remain. The Democratic Party has seemingly crushed the progressive insurgency of the Democratic Party. The tension of capitalism's tight grasp grows closer and closer to snapping, and yet they tell us and told us communism is dead. Communism died when Chairman Deng reformed the Chinese economy. Communism died when the Berlin Wall fell, they said. Marxism remains relevant because the historical conditions and scientific theories of Marx's times remain relevant. In fact, the more the capitalist state apparatus tries to relegate Marxism to the margins of history, paradoxically, the more powerful its ghost becomes. The less Marxism plays into society, the more capitalists have the license to push the contradictions that enabled Marxism to develop as a philosophy to begin with. Until something resolves the contradictions that developed out of workers' movements in a material conception of history, Marx will always remain relevant. Interestingly, you could say the same thing about fascism, although fascism is less of a coherent philosophical ideology, and it's more just like power-hungry people who seize power in a capitalist vacuum. But you could say that, maybe fascism development out of the alienation and isolation of the capitalist mode of production mixed with the development of the pseudoscience race science or race realism or whatever they want to call that, which is complete pseudoscience. But one could say that fascism will always be a creeping threat as long as those material conditions remain true. So, in a way, fascism doesn't apply because I believe that communism is the answer to stopping fascism. Fascism is only enabled by capitalism. And to close, I want to say, quote, Badiou, Alain Badiou. He has a great long quote from his book, The Communist Hypothesis. It starts slow because he talks about math, but bear with me because he makes a really good point. Quote, "Take a scientific problem which may well take the form of a hypothesis until such time as it is resolved. It could be, for example, that Fermat's theorem is a hypothesis if you formulate it as, quote, for greater than n, I assume the occasion x to the nth power plus y to the nth power equals z to the nth power has no whole solutions, solutions in which x, y, and z are whole numbers." Quote, end quote. Within Badiou. That's an end quote within Badiou. He's still continuing. "Countless attempts were made to prove this, from Fermat, who formulated the hypothesis and claimed to have it proved it, but that not need concern us here, to Wiles, the English mathematician, who really did prove it a few years ago. Many of those attempts became the starting point for mathematical developments of great import, even though they did not succeed in solving the problem itself. It was therefore vital not to abandon the hypothesis for the 300 years during which it was impossible to prove it. The lessons of all the failures in the process of examining them and their implications were the lifeblood of mathematics. In that sense, failure is nothing more than the history of the proof of the hypothesis, provided that the hypothesis is not abandoned. As Mao puts it, the logic of imperialists and all reactionaries the world over is make trouble, fail, make trouble again. But the logic of the people is fight, fail, fail again, till their victory. The point is, we have not abandoned the hypothesis of Marx because the conditions that yielded Marxism are still relevant to our society. So the failures to implement that are not actually failures. They're simply attempts at the hypothesis who failed. But they didn't fail the hypothesis. It still exists, and it will still continue to exist as long as there's problems within capitalism, which there will always be problems within capitalism. So Marxism is never going away as long as capitalism still exists.
State of the state.
And that has been the state of the state.